Jim, our next question sent to cornydrivethru@gmail.com is from Dave Sosiska. Dave Sasidka, Dave Sasidka in Epping, New Hampshire.
In Epping, New Hampshire? What the hell did New Hampshire ever do to you? You got that fucking New Hampshire.
Not effing, Epping.
Oh, never mind.
Let's go to Dave's question. I know both of you are historians and collectors. As a young fan in the 1970s in the WWF territory, I remember being disappointed at the poor selection and quality of souvenirs available at the local wrestling shows. If some visionary, before Vince, had come along, could promoters' fortunes have turned based on having better merchandise to sell fans, at least partially?
Is that it?
That was it.
Okay, I think the question can be boiled down to if they had better merchandise in those days, would they have made more money? And yes, obviously the answer is yes. Some places did. I mean, there was always an arena program. We mentioned Jerry Jarrett earlier. His first job when he was 8 years old or whatever was selling Slamagram programs for 5 cents a piece back then. But in 1950, if you sold 1,000 of those, that was $50, and $50 in 1950 is what, $600 or $700 today. There were always programs, and the office could keep all the profit above the cost of printing. And yes, there was merchandising of individual wrestlers, especially the first, round of TV network in the 50s. There was the Vern Gagne wrestling game and all that other stuff. But the territories really didn't get into merchandising the guys because the guys would bitch and they'd want to cut, and they didn't want to go through all that shit, and they didn't see the value in it. And then later on, as the business got hot in the 80s, I mean, Tennessee with me was again early on selling major multiples of pictures of all the talent and T-shirts and Frisbees. And Lawler had some guy in Memphis that did merchandise for him. There were Jerry Lawler drinking cups and Jimmy Valiant Frisbees and all this shit, right? And none of it was expensive because people weren't going to spend. There were no replica belts. There were no big ticket items. The fans weren't going to spend that kind of money back then. But everybody, when you had 5,000 people coming to a building every week, and they were going to spend a couple dollars on a picture at a program, then that would add up over the course of the year, as we've talked about before. But I think part of it is the promoters didn't want to figure a lot of the guys in on cuts, on merchandise specifically featuring them, unless they were just the biggest guy in the territory. Vern would do some stuff with the Crusher, whatever.
Vern was fighting with Hogan over merch stuff, remember?
Yeah, because he didn't want to, they didn't want to turn loose of. A lot of times the promoters would just sell shit of the guys and not give them any money, and the guys would bitch. Other times they didn't want to because they didn't want to cut them in, so they kept it to just their promotion, their program, and, a T-shirt of, hey, All-Star Wrestling or whatever. But
I have all the records, all the financial records, all the correspondence, everything for all the deals Norm Keitzer did with various guys, from the Destroyer to Mad Dog Vachon to the Crusher, various other people.
And see, those guys were taking matters in their own hands and selling their own shit, putting an ad in the wrestling magazines. So they didn't have to go through the promoter at the live events. But that's the way it was. They definitely all could have made more money, as those of us who tried found out when I started the Championship Wrestling magazine. They were, I think, $3 a piece, and the fans would pay it because they got all kinds of pictures of their favorite wrestlers and got to read about them. And they had something they could get autographed. And then, obviously, since then, it's blown up into a multi-million-dollar business, merchandising, with everything from belts to ring-worn stuff to replicas of all kinds of shit. But in the old days, I loved the paper shit. I just loved the documentation of, here was the card, here's news on what was happening, the arena program, and the old magazines. But there's somebody that collects everything these days. But yeah, a lot more money could have been made back then if they'd bothered to, but they didn't expand that way.
I'm always blown away that no one tried to do anything action figure wise, even cheaply, very, very cheaply, before the LJNs took off here in the States. I'm not counting Japan, obviously.
Again, the toy companies didn't have pro wrestling on their radar, and the wrestling promoters didn't have toy companies on their radar, and they really didn't think about it. And then the question, because of the transitory nature also, I'll say this and then we can move on to where, because it's your show. But the time that it takes, and we know the lead time in getting action figures made and developing and stuff and everything, no wrestlers were under contract. And if you, as a promoter, spend any time and effort in talking to a toy company and setting up a deal like that, unless it was a deal like it was, Watts in McGurk's territory or Lawler and Jarrett's territory, or one of the top guys that were in the office or owned a piece of the thing wasn't going anywhere, you might set all that stuff up, and by the time the figures are ready to be released, the guy's been gone from your territory for 6 months. And then what the fuck? Who gives a shit? Nobody's going to buy them. Out of sight, out of mind. They got new talent. It just didn't work when guys weren't under exclusive contract for long periods of time and merchandising systems already in place, and etc.
It's amazing to think about what wrestling could have been financially if any of the mechanisms that are there today in terms of shirts or figures or anything were there back then. Everyone wants to say, look at how much money they're making now. You can't even compare them to some of the people of the past. We don't know what a lot of those people would have made.
Well, again, in 1986, the Rock and Roll Express fan club, what was it to join? Was it $10 or was it $12? You got the 45 record, you got the fucking life-size poster and a newsletter, and they did $2 million on that in a short period of time.
Now imagine if the Rock and Roll Express came around in the last few years. They would be able to have a new shirt, as much as they want, but let's say a new shirt every month.
Yeah.
They'd be able to have action figures that they could sell at a nice markup and then sign. They'd be able to do it all themselves. They had none of that. Think of how much money, if you actually just start thinking about how many people join that fan club and give a percentage of that audience would buy an action figure of Ricky and Robert, or buy a shirt, maybe 2 shirts if they're once a month. Who knows? Think about how much money they could have made.
Well, besides the cameos, can you imagine?
Wow, yeah, I didn't even think of that. Yeah.
the girls between the ages of 13 and 25, just in the states of North and South Carolina, that would have asked for their birthday, for Christmas, just let Ricky and Robert speak my name on video and blow me a kiss. I'll pay any price. I'll do it. If these girls would do anything, and I mean anything, already just to get Ricky and Robert to wave at them. So, I mean, nobody in wrestling today is as popular as the Rock and Roll Express were in the Carolinas in 1986. That's a pretty foregone fucking conclusion. So the money they could have made if they could have reached all those people was insane.
Well, Jim, it would probably be a pretty depressing thought for Ricky or Robert to think about the money they could have made, or maybe even the money they did make and just weren't paid.
Oh, they can't dwell on it. They can't dwell on it. It would be very anxiety producing.
I think so. And if that was the case, they would probably need someone to talk to.
Well, and folks, if you feel like that you've been screwed out of a couple $1 million on your fan club, or if you came along too early to get cameo video messages out to all the girls that are lusting after you, and it's still giving you anxiety, or any other reason that you need to talk to somebody, well, then go to our old friends at BetterHelp, because after all, this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp, along with many of them here in our archives, because consistently we've had feedback from the Cult of Cornette members that therapy, and specifically trying BetterHelp, help them solve problems, get over issues, or become a better person when life gets you bogged down and you feel overwhelmed and you're not out there pumping the way you need to be. Sometimes you just need to run something by someone else, get another viewpoint or someone else's opinion on things. And that's what the folks at BetterHelp do with licensed therapists. They are I'm trying to figure out the exact verbiage, the world's largest at this type of thing, certainly the most well thought of. It's convenient, flexible, affordable, entirely online. You fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time, no additional charge. And you can do it on your schedule, in your own time, in your own way, but you can make the effort to make some changes in your life if you want to live a more empowered life. That's what Laurinaitis told me one time we ought to do to the wrestlers. We ought to empower them instead of yell at them. I said, how about just some way or another making them figure their shit out however we do it? However you want to do it, BetterHelp will help you do it. So all you got to do is go to BetterHelp. That's HELP, BetterHelp.com/JCE, and you're going to get 10% off your first month's services. BetterHelp.com/JCE for 10% off your first month's services. When you need somebody to talk to, because we're just talking at you. You can talk back to us, but we can't hear you. Well, the people at BetterHelp can hear you, except for that one deaf therapist they got named Sam. He can't hear it.
There's no deaf therapist named Sam. Let's not joke about this. They have fine therapists that you should check out today. If you need someone to talk to, there's BetterHelp.
I thought he was trying to communicate with me in sign language. You're telling me he was just telling me what he thought of me?
I guess so. I guess so. How are we supposed to end it? BetterHelp.
BetterHelp.com/JCE. If you need help, like Brian, BetterHelp.
I certainly do right now, but Jim.
Yes.
There are some other people in wrestling that may need some help.